Hello, so today we're going to be talking about the opposition and rebuttal speeches in a policy round. So we've already gone over the Prime Minister constructive speech. So remember that entire structure where you have the problem, the plan, and the advantages. But that's just the first speech of a policy round. There are 5 more to go, so what do we do now? Well, let's just remember the other speeches, and today we're going to be focusing on the off case of the Leader of Opposition, since the LOC is going to be introducing it. Then we're going to talk about rebuttaling, which happens in the 2 member speeches, and then the rebuttal speeches themselves, which are happening in the last 2 speeches. So, if we remember, the rebuttal speeches, no new information, but the constructive speeches do have new information. So let's look at the opposition case, or the off case that is introduced in the Leader of Opposition constructive. So the off case is the constructive part of the opposition's case, everything that's not a direct refutation to the gov's case. So this should be review. We've explained that it's the separate arguments that the op brings up as a separate reason to vote for itself, rather than explaining why the government team is wrong. Then the on case is just the constructive part of the gov's case. So the entire Prime Minister constructive right here for the policy round was constructive, since we have these reasons to vote gov and the reasons why it's meeting its burden. So we have this harm, plan, and advantages. Now, the op case is much simpler, the off case, than the on case, because it just is structured in disadvantages rather than having this whole long structure. Everything is in Toulmin's model. So we have claim, data, and impact, and these are called disadvantages. These are just problems that the plan creates, and they're kind of like the evil twin of advantages. Advantages are like, our plan does so many good things. Here are some good impacts that the plan creates. Whereas disadvantages say, no, the plan actually does a lot of harm, and here are the negative or detrimental impacts that the plan creates. You can have as many disadvantages as you want, however, it's recommended to have about 2 to 3. 2 to 3 is kind of like the magic number, so let's just imagine a disadvantage for this resolution. The United States federal government should implement uniforms for all public schools. So this disadvantage is about student expression. So I have this claim that states that school uniforms restrict freedom of expression, some data, and this impact. Now, the idea of these impacts are that you're going to be explaining the negative effects that the plan creates and why these negative effects are so bad that even if the plan solves, even if it does everything right, the negative aspects of the plan just undo all of that and actually don't justify passing the plan in the first place. So you have to really explain why this right to self-expression is important and how they have to fight for important causes. So this impact is vital to explaining why your entire disadvantage is important and why the entire plan no longer stands. So part of the job of the LOC is to introduce the off case and bring up this constructive set of disadvantages. But what about the specific attacks on what the Prime Minister specifically said before? So this is where you're going to be fulfilling the ops burden. So remember that the opposition team's burden is to prove 2 things: that either the status quo is actually fine, that the harm doesn't exist, or that the plan doesn't solve and actually does more harm than good. So there are a couple of ways that you can do that with some specific arguments that occur on the opposition case. So, firstly, on either the gov or op, it doesn't even matter which side you're on, you're going to be using this 4-step refutation format. It goes like this. They say blank, but we say blank because blank. So, blank. Or they say, and then say the thing that they said, but we say that that's not true because, and then explain why. Since it's untrue, I urge you to disregard this argument. I urge you to take it out, to turn it. We're going to get into what that means a little bit later. Or to bring back this argument so their refutation against my argument no longer stands. So there are 3 types of rebuttals. You want to take out, to minimize, or to turn. Now, regardless again of whether you're on the government team or the opposition team, you're going to be taking out, minimizing, and turning. So both sides should be doing this. This really comes out in the LOC, the MGC, and the MOC, because this is where you're going to be attacking your opponent's case in addition to supporting your own. So let's look at what a takeout means. A takeout is just like saying nope. The idea is that the judge should disregard the argument because it's incorrect or irrelevant or wrong in some sort of way. This is the most common type of attack. You're just going to be saying my opponents are using erroneous logic and and this argument is untrue because, and then you explain it. So here we have this takeout of AD1. So they say school uniforms will improve student behavior, but we say it has no effect because, and then we have this explanation, so their advantage can be completely taken out or disregarded. I urge you to not pay attention to it because it has been proven false. So here we have our four-step refutation structure. Then we have a minimize. This is where you're going to demonstrate that the argument is not actually as significant as the other team makes it out to be. It's like a weaker version of a takeout. So instead of pressing delete, you're just going to be shrinking it. Now, typically, if you can take something out, you're going to want to take it out because minimize is just kind of weaker. However, you can't always deny something is true, which is what a takeout does. Rather, a minimize just says that it's not as big as the gov-op is painting it to be. So it can help your credibility to say, okay, maybe they're not wrong. However, it's not actually that important because, and then to explain why. So here's a minimize on harm one. They say that clothes cause inequality due to socioeconomic differences, but we say that their impacts are not really true. They're out of proportion because socioeconomic differences will always cause inequality, and so ultimately, since it's unclear how impactful uniforms are, minimize the argument. So let's look at the final attack or rebuttal that tends to actually be the strongest, and this is a turn. This is where you claim that their argument actually supports your own case, and you usually can't turn an argument because there's a very specific set of circumstances where you can actually prove that your opponent's argument supports your own. But when you can absolutely turn, it is the strongest because in addition to them losing an argument, you're gaining one. So here's where you might turn harm one. They say that clothes cause inequality, but we say that this is actually more true in a world with the plan because, and I have this explanation of why. So turn harm one because socioeconomic differences only become clear when all students wear the same clothing. Something like that. So here we're taking the impacts of the gov and putting them on the opposition. Now gov can turn too, but this is just an example where the op is turning harm one. Now, this four-step refutation structure doesn't actually have to be followed to the T. Now, unlike, other structures where you have to have contentions and counter-contentions and policy structures exactly like that, the four-step refutation is more of a guideline. You're just going to want to keeping in mind what they said, then what you're going to say to counter that and the reasoning behind that, and what the judge should then do with the knowledge that this argument has been proven false or minimized or turned. Now, remember when making a rebuttal or refutation, specifically say the words take out, minimize, and turn. It's much neater for your judge, for your opponents, for everyone. Now let's look at some op attacks. And remember, the op, to meet its burden, has a few specific lines of reasoning that are deployed. This is important to attacking the harm, or defending the status quo, and to attacking the plan. So you're going to be saying the plan doesn't solve or does more harm than good. So let's take a look. Now, there's one argument, which is known as non-uniqueness. So these impacts will exist regardless of whether a plan exists or not. It's used on anything, harm, advantage, disadvantages, anything at all. So Gov actually can use non-unique attacks as well, but it tends to be more common on the op. This is like a rare example where non-uniqueness can be used on both the Gov and op. All these other arguments can only be used for the opposition against the Gov, but non-uniqueness applies to the opposition team as well. So this is where we're going to be saying, yeah, well, believe it or not, there's always going to be this issue. And whether or not we pass a plan, whether you like the Gov's world better or my world or the opposition team's world better, it's just going to exist. So this plan doesn't actually impact it at all. So, for instance, here's this example. The impacts of harm 1 states that inequality from clothes causes socioeconomic issues, but this is non-unique because these divides exist regardless of whether or not school uniforms are required. So, essentially, believe it or not, socioeconomic issues do not stem from inequalities in clothes, rather, it's the other way around. So, this is non unique. These impacts will always exist, regardless of whether or not you decide to pass the government team's plan. Then we have this dealing from solvency, which is where you're saying the plan does not solve for the harms presented. Used only by the op on plans, and doesn't actually have to deny the harm. So here you're saying, okay, maybe we agree climate change exists. However, this doesn't matter because the plan doesn't fix this problem, and so we're going to delink this plan from solvency. So here's this example for the specific resolution we're using. So the plan does not solve for the harm of teen anxiety and quality of life due to socioeconomic disparities because these disparities will exist regardless. Therefore, we can delink this plan from solvency and prove that it doesn't work. then you can argue that the plan does more harm than good. So it's only used on plants and only used by the op. So you don't actually have to deny the harms. Again, you don't even have to deny solvency, which is really key. Rather, you can prove, okay, maybe the plan solves, maybe the harm exists. However, these impacts that the plan will cause, these negative impacts, are so bad that this doesn't even matter because the cost does not justify the fight. We don't actually want to pass this plan because of all these negative impacts that it causes, in addition to perhaps the small good, few good ones that it also causes. So here's an example. The plan makes violence and behavioral issues worse, doing more harm than good. So sometimes you want to argue that the plan actually makes the initial problem or the initial harm worse. That actually works even better. So here we're arguing that it makes the initial problem even more severe. Finally, you can argue that there are no advantages without a plan, and this is again used only by the op when the plan has been delinked from solvency. So think about it this way. If a plan doesn't work, if it doesn't solve, then obviously no good impacts can come of solving it because it's a failure. It doesn't work. So for instance, we have delinked their plan from solvency, and there can't be advantages to a plan that doesn't solve. All right, now let's look at another idea, which is cross-applying. This is when you apply a previous line of argumentation to a separate argument. You can't just say something like, cross-apply harm 1, because the judges don't know what that means. Rather, you want to explain why the previous arguments that you stated apply to this new situation. For example, they say that clothes allow for individual expression, but cross-apply are harm 1, which state this, that it only highlights inequity rather than individuality. So here we're saying cross apply or apply the arguments that we made previously because look, it'll only cause inequity rather than individuality. So cross applying can be used on both the gov and the op. Now, with all these rebuttals, cross applying, takeouts, and turns, it's really important to keep a neat flow. A really key part of this is signposting. Signposting is just where you say where you are on the flow. For instance, I'm going to be moving down the flow. I will attack harm 1, and then you proceed to attack harm 1. I am currently attacking disadvantage 2, then you attack disadvantage 2. So this way you tell the judge and your opponents exactly where you are on the flow, and you make it really clear where you're applying your arguments. So signposting is hugely important. Otherwise, you end up with flows like mine, and that is my flow, I'm not proud to say. So signposting is super key to maintaining a neat and clean debate. Now, let's look at rebuttal speeches, which is what to do when you can't say anything new. And remember, it's literally against the rules to bring up any new argumentation in the rebuttal speeches, so you want to make sure that you do two main things. Firstly, you want to weigh. And we already went over weighing a little bit. Now, in a policy case, the way you're going to want to weigh is to look at the voting criteria and weighing mechanism. Just as a reminder, the weighing mechanism is one of 3 items that explain what your policy is trying to accomplish. So, util, equity, or pragmatism. Now, the voting criteria is the group that you're trying to benefit. So, people in San Diego, net benefits for people in Mexico, people in Taiwan, people of the world. So, this is the group that you're trying to help with your policy. Now, there are several ways to impact weigh. We're not actually going to go over it now, but the idea is you're going to explain that my impacts are more applicable to the weighing mechanism and voting criteria than my opponents. Both sides should impact weigh. So, here's an example for the government team. Our weighing mechanism today is utilitarianism, and it is not at all utilitarian to allow teens to be subject to these mental health issues on account of clothing of all things. Therefore, when we're looking at the weighing mechanism, our policy does the most good for the most amount of people because we are ensuring that we get rid of these mental health issues, and we are also doing the most for our voting criteria because we are doing the most to benefit public school students. Now, here's what you might do for the opposition, which is to say, look, our weighing mechanism is utilitarianism, and it's not at all utilitarian to halt self expression. So, we, looking at the voting criteria, actually benefit public school students the most because we allow for freedom of expression for students at large. So, in this way, you're going to compare your impacts to the weighing mechanism and voting criteria and explain why your impacts outweigh your opponents'. So, I didn't actually do this literally, but again, you're going to say mental health overcomes any possible impact about self expression because we're talking about quality of life, depression, and anxiety. Or on the op, you'd say, our impacts about self expression overcome any gov impacts about mental health because it's a fundamental right to be able to express yourself and to voice your own opinions. So you're going to be comparing these impacts based on util and your voting criteria, which would be the people going to public schools. So really key to remember in any policy round, compare the weighing mechanism and voting criteria. Then you're going to engage in some voters. And we already brought this up in a previous presentation. You're just going to be pointing out to the judge where you're winning. Judge, we have clearly kept our harm and our plan intact. And since they did not adequately refute this, we urge you to vote for our side. Or, for instance, we defended both our disadvantages and completely took out the government team's case. Therefore, we urge you to vote for the opposition team. So you're going to engage in some voters or point out where you're winning and why you've met your burdens depending on what team you're on. So that's the end of this presentation, and I hope you learned something about how to respond to the government prime minister constructive case in a policy round. Thank you.